When you think about medicine, the goal is almost always to fix something, right? To repair, to reconstruct, to make a person whole again. But what if the best option, the most compassionate option, was to do the complete opposite? Today, we're going to dive into a real medical paradox, a surgery that seems to go against everything we think we know about modern orthopedics.
And that brings us to this wild and honestly pretty counterintuitive question. Why on earth would a surgeon, whose entire training is about fixing joints, decide that the best thing to do is just remove the ball of the hip joint altogether? Just take it out and leave an empty socket. I mean, it sounds radical, almost medieval, but there is a powerful, compelling reason behind it.
Okay, so this procedure has a name. It's called a Girdlestone resection arthroplasty, or GRA for short, and it is literally what it sounds like. The surgeons go in and they remove the femoral head. That's the ball in the hip's ball and socket joint. And that's it. No replacement, no shiny new artificial joint gets put in its place. The ball is just gone.
And yeah, the results of this are pretty intense, and they're unavoidable. The patient's leg ends up way shorter. We're talking 5 to 10 centimeters shorter. The hip itself is left unstable, so they'll need a walker or crutches for the rest of their life. It completely changes the way they walk, permanently. So that initial question just gets bigger. Why would anyone ever choose this?
Well, to really get why this exists, we got to rewind the clock a bit. See, this surgery wasn't invented for the problems we face today. It was a life-saving idea born in a medical world that looked very, very different.
The whole purpose of this procedure has just evolved like crazy over the last 100 years. It all started back in 1928, way before we had good antibiotics. A surgeon named Gathorne Girdlestone came up with it to treat tuberculosis of the hip, which back then could easily kill you. By just taking out the infected bone, he saved people's lives. Fast forward to the 1940s, and it was being used on soldiers with nasty infections from gunshot wounds. Then, the 60s roll around with modern hip replacements, and the Girdlestone finds a new job. It becomes the ultimate salvage operation for when those new implants went horribly wrong. And that brings us to today, where its whole purpose is being completely rethought.
Look, total hip replacement is one of the biggest success stories in modern medicine, for sure. But nothing's perfect, and when these hips fail, they can fail in a really bad way, leading to what is probably the most feared complication out there, a prosthetic joint infection.
Now, 1 to 2%, that might not sound like a lot, right? But millions of these surgeries happen every year all over the world. So that seemingly small percentage means thousands of people are facing these devastating infections deep inside their bone, an infection that's almost impossible to get rid of while that metal implant is still in there.
Okay, take a look at this X-ray. This right here, this is the nightmare scenario we're talking about. This isn't just a simple infection. The artificial hip has completely failed, it's come loose, and it has actually pushed its way up into the patient's pelvis, and the whole thing is just surrounded by infection. This is an absolute disaster.
And here's the after. Same patient, they've had the Girdlestone procedure. You can see all that infected metal hardware is gone. The bone is clear. And now, finally, that raging infection can be controlled. The hip joint is gone, yes, but the patient's life has likely been saved. And for decades, this was the Girdlestone's main job, the surgery of last resort.
Okay, but here's where the story really takes a turn, and it gets super interesting. What if this procedure wasn't just about saving someone at the last minute? What if, for a very specific kind of patient, it was actually the best, most compassionate choice right from the start?
And this is the modern dilemma right here. Picture this, an elderly, very frail patient, someone who is already confined to a bed or a wheelchair, has a fall and breaks their hip. They couldn't walk before the fall, and they're not going to walk after it's fixed. So the real question for the doctors isn't just how do we fix the bone, it's what is the best and kindest thing we can do for this person?
So we're talking about a very specific kind of patient here, Someone who is severely frail, maybe with a lot of other health issues going on. They aren't walking, their life expectancy might be quite limited, and for them, a big, long, complex surgery like a standard hip replacement carries a massive, massive risk.
And this sets up the ultimate medical trade-off. Do you put this person through a huge standard operation, or do you do this smaller, seemingly more destructive one? Well, researchers have actually started to compare these two options directly, and the data shows just how tough of a choice this really is.
So you've basically got two very different paths. On one side, you have the standard surgery, a hemiarthroplasty, where you replace the broken part with metal. The whole point is to restore function, but it's a long, complex, and for this kind of patient, a very risky operation.
On the other side, you have the Girdlestone. Its goal isn't function at all. It's simply to get rid of the pain and reduce the immediate shock of surgery. It's way shorter and less invasive.
And this data from a study by Belova and her team, wow, it really lays out the brutal reality of this trade-off. Look, the Girdlestone surgery is literally twice as fast. That's a huge deal for a frail person under anesthesia. But then you see that last line, and it's a shocker, a 71% mortality rate within a year compared to 49% for the standard surgery. Now, it is so important to understand this number correctly. This does not mean the surgery is causing more people to die. What it means is that doctors are already choosing this less demanding surgery for the absolute sickest, most frail patients, the ones who are least likely to survive for another year in the first place.
So here's what it all boils down to. The choice is between a much easier surgery for the body to handle, which is being given to patients who are already very close to the end of their life, or a much tougher, more demanding surgery that offers a chance at better function, but only if that fragile patient is strong enough to survive the operation itself. It's truly one of the hardest calls in all of medicine.
And this is really where the whole way of thinking about this surgery has started to shift. As one research team put it, the Girdlestone, or GRA, should be considered not a marker of failure, but as a definitive procedure that gives predictability in challenging situations. It's about completely changing the goalposts. The goal isn't a perfect functioning hip anymore. The goal is a predictable outcome, pain relief with the least amount of surgical trauma possible for someone at the very end of their life.
Which leaves us with this big, important question, right? When we're working at the absolute limits of what medicine can do for the most frail people in our society, how should we actually measure success? Is success a perfect-looking joint on an X-ray? Or is it a person's peaceful, pain-free quality of life, no matter how short that life might be? The story of this strange, radical surgery really forces us to think about what actually matters most.